This is Nikki Martin at Education Northwest, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Responding to Signature Wounds of the Iraq and Afghanistan Conflicts, Post-Traumatic Stress and Traumatic Brain Injury. This is a repeat of our December 12th webinar. We're very popular, and we've decided to repeat it because many folks were available before the holiday, and we had a technical difficulty with our recording, so we hope to remedy both of those situations today. Just a couple quick housekeeping items before I pass it on to Bob Reed, who's going to kick us off. Our phones are muted on entry. We do this to minimize background noise and limit actions for our presenters. You will have an opportunity to ask questions and make comments using the chat function, and that's on the right-hand side of your screen. We encourage you to do that, and we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. Also, at the end of the webinar, when you exit, you should automatically see a brief evaluation survey. We ask you to please take a few minutes to fill that out for us. These are monthly webinars, and your feedback is really important in helping us improve them. So with no further ado, I am going to pass it along to Bob, who's going to set the stage for the webinar and talk about our learning goals and our presenters. Thanks, Bob.
Hello and good afternoon or good morning, depending what part of the country you're from. I'm Bob Reed. I'm the project director of the American Legion Auxiliary Call to Service Corps, and that is our organizations in veterans in AmeriCorps and AmeriCorps to support the military and veteran community. And we're very pleased to be collaborating with Education Northwest, Point Light, and the Corporation for National and Community Service to develop a learning and development series in the veteran military space. Hence my role as being one of the introducers today. And so that's who I am, and if we could go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about what we're up to today. Today's session is part of a series that we've been offering together to help build awareness and competence in the national service sector around the needs and opportunities of service and serving veterans in the military community. And so today's focus is on the signature wounds of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflict, post-traumatic stress, and traumatic brain injury. That's by no means to suggest that people who served in our nation in these current conflicts, or at least one of them is wrapping up, that there aren't all sorts of injuries and mortal wounds, but two are really prominent in this particular conflict that due to the military community are PTS and TBI. And so that's why we're focusing on that today. So post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury are considered signature wounds of these conflicts, but again, not the only. Efforts are being made by the governmental authorities to increase their capacity to treat veterans with these wounds, but the supply of clinicians is insufficient to meet demand. Therefore, that's a tremendous opportunity area for the nonprofit and volunteer sector to be supportive. It also provides challenges, however, to those of us in the space that are attempting to serve veterans and military, both either engaging them as volunteers or providing service to them as our constituents. So that's what we're up to focusing on today. We have a really talented pool of speakers, and they're going to focus on these learning goals. By the end of this session today, you'll obtain some basic knowledge of post-traumatic stress and TBI. They're made about terms in the press, but we need to actually understand about the science and how these injuries to the brain affect all sorts of aspects of someone's life. We'll have a program for mobilizing volunteers to treat service members and veterans with post-traumatic stress and TI. So volunteerism and national service as a rehabilitation strategy for the as well as a service opportunity for the community they're in. And I guess I said that on the third point as well. So we see this as a great opportunity for the national service sector to engage veterans with these complex life of service agents in their community. Are backward instead of forward. No. Kobe's on. So say hello. Kobe, say who you say hello.
I appreciate it. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody again for taking the time this afternoon and this morning, depending upon where you are, to participate in this session. The corporation is proud to support and help profit entities and organizations like the American Legion and like the Washington State Vet Corps and others expand services to veteran military family community by leveraging national service members. And this is an important topic because the corporation was authorized to start this work in 2009. So what it means is the corporation wasn't necessarily focused at a strategic level on how we could bring national service and volunteer efforts to bear to support military families, as well as to leverage the leadership skills and abilities of veterans and military families as national service members themselves in 2009. So we're growing at, I would say, a torrid pace from where we were in 2009, having now put over 1,600 AmeriCorps members on the ground this year that have been working in this space, revenues of almost 200% past 2 years. Grow at that pace, you really start identifying some areas of need and some gaps, really in gaps of knowledge of service and knowledge of need. And that's what these webinar series are designed to do. They were originally conceived by the American Legion Auxiliary and the Community Blueprint along with Points of Light, and they're supported by some of the great individuals we have out there in the field, AmeriCorps members and subject matter experts from agencies like the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Center for Post-Traumatic Stress and TBI. And this kind of sharing of information is important because we grow. We want to make sure that we're growing correctly and we're meeting the need where the need actually exists as opposed to where we think it exists. So I want to thank everybody again, once again, for taking the time to this session. Remind everybody that the importance of this work, be as candid and open and honest about this issue and subject matter as we can, if we actually want to do this the right way. So non-attribution applies obviously in this forum, in that we're all trying to grow together. And then lastly, I would just say that we're going to be here as the need is there, and the CEO here at the corporation, the President and the First Lady, and Dr. Biden through the Joining Forces Initiative has made it clear that our veteran military family community is a federal agency priority that will be supported both CNCS and elsewhere. So we're going to be here for you guys. We're going to continue to expand our support in this area, and I want to thank again the leadership of both Education Northwest, but most importantly American Legion and Community Blueprint. So thank you.
All right, I'm back on deck to say hello to our awesome team of speakers. We have, as you can see, there's lots of sciencing acronyms after their names. So we've really been able to assemble a pool of talent, professionally and clinically and academically. So are delighted to have with us today a veteran who has been a national service participant, who used national service as a pathway for his own rehabilitation and has turned that into a leadership opportunity to assist others. And so our speakers today include Shannon McCaslin. She's with the National Center for PTSD, which is a center within the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, which she'll tell you more about that center, but it basically is both supporting VA clinicians as well as clinicians in the profit and outside of the VA system and the general public, and anyone else who has contact with veterans understanding PTS and what our various responsibilities are. Kent Corso is Clinical Director of Given Hour, which is an organization that uses volunteering as its strategy to deliver mental health services to service members, veterans, and their families in need of mental and behavioral health support. And we also have today Tim Lovett. He's the TBI Project coordinator and a trainer on invisible wounds. He's with the Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs and has just a very had practice in helping all of us understand the consequences of these signature wounds war. And I'm also really proud to say that Tim and I were teammates in a leadership development opportunity offered by the American Express Leadership Academy with the support of the corporation for National Community Service. So both ALA graduates and are really grateful to the corporation for its investment in us professionally so that we could it's the military and veteran focus area of the corporation through our respective work. So, not to shortchange the other talented people, just want to give a shout out to a co-graduate there, Tim. So I'll turn it back over to Nikki to the next part of the session.
No further ado, we'll just pass it to Shannon.
Good evening, good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this this webinar. So I'm going to an overview of post-traumatic stress symptoms, and again, this is not intended to be 100% comprehensive, which would take a lot longer than our 15 minutes to do that. I'm going to give you just an outline of post-traumatic stress and talk a little bit about some different best practices for treating trauma. Next slide. So generally, our nation's returning veterans, you're talking here about over 2 million service members who've been deployed in support of the current conflicts. About half of those deployed more than once, and a substantial number who are deployed multiple times. 15% female, a large number married, and also having children, and a large number of our returning veterans are coming from rural areas. Next slide, please. Before I go into post-traumatic stress symptoms, I just want to talk a little bit about what is a traumatic event, or what is trauma. And in psychological health, we generally talk about psychological trauma as being an event that has some element of threat to physical integrity, threat to life, a really intense event. And this is a list of examples of those types of events, being combat as one of those. Often in just our everyday life, we talk about events as being traumatic, but often those don't technically qualify as traumas for a diagnosis of PTSD or post-traumatic stress symptoms, even if they're very, very highly stressful and have a large impact on our lives. Next slide, please. This type of trauma exposure is common, and most people will actually experience at least one event that would qualify as traumatic during their lifetime, and many will experience more than one event. And you can see the frequency of these different types of events which differ for men and women. The slide here can give you an idea of which events tend to be experienced more by men versus women. Traumas in military service, just to give a taste of that, what we think of as traditional combat traumas include things like firefights, a lot of death and dying, medical care in the field, dealing with bodies, and as well as non-traditional combat traumas such as atrocities, abuse of violence, guerrilla-style warfare, so IEDs, improvised explosive devices. Other military traumas can include sexual assault, physical assaults, and accidents. So, in training and in military service, other things happen. Motor vehicle accidents happen, explosions, burns, things that can even be outside of a combat setting. Next slide, please. So, after combat exposure, there can be a number of different reactions, and we hear a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder through the media and just in general when we're just in the outside environment, the civilian setting. PTSD is actually a disease that occurs in the minority of events. And actually, generally, after combat exposure, for most people, readjustment would take some time. You could think of the military as being another culture, and shifting from a military cultural setting or a combat setting to a civilian setting naturally is a big adjustment, and for most people will take some time. Is the cultural adjustment around differences in structure, differences in camaraderie, differences in relationships, things like that, adjusting back to being in your family again after being deployed, adjusting to different work settings, and then also, along with being in combat, can often come losses of people you were close to, comrades, and that carries with it grief that can come up periodically for people and can also be an issue. There's also traumatic stress symptoms that are adaptive, or things that skills that can be adaptive in the combat setting that may not translate so well to the civilian setting and may take some time to adjust. So, for example, I've had veterans tell me that they train themselves not to sleep at night, and so learning how to do that again can take some time. But for some, minority recovery is much more challenging, and that can be because of visible injuries, such as physical injuries, or invisible injuries, the sequelae of mild traumatic brain injury or psychological injuries like post-traumatic stress and depression. Next slide, please. What is post-traumatic stress disorder? It was first included in the DSM-3 in 1980 in the Statistical Manual, Diagnostic Statistical Manual. The current diagnostic criteria, which will change with the initiation of DSM-5, but not dramatically, is that you must have a traumatic stressor as defined by DSM, and symptoms that fall within these three clusters. So the intrusive recollections, avoiding and numbing, and hyperarousal symptoms. The symptoms must also be present for at least 1 month and must cause significant distress or impairment in at least one domain of someone's life. So that can include social functioning, work functioning, and also just kind of generally in their life. It can range from mild to severe. Next slide, please. In terms of what a traumatic stressor is, according to DSM, currently it states that the event should be something that has threatened a person's life or safety, or they witness something happening to another individual where someone's life was threatened. So be something that the person learned about, such as a serious accident or to a loved one. Threat to physical integrity also counts in that. Next slide, please. Again, to review the diagnostic criteria, the first cluster of symptoms include re-experiencing an event through upsetting memories or nightmares. And these can be memories that are triggered by something in the environment. So if they see something that reminds them of what has occurred, it can come up. The second cluster is avoiding reminders or thoughts of the event, so feeling, and this can also include feeling numb or cut off, detached from others. You might see social withdrawal in this cluster. And next are hyperarousal symptoms, so feeling keyed up, easily startled, and this includes sleep disturbance. Many people will talk about feeling anxious when they're in crowds or in unpredictable kind of settings where there's lots of people, irritability, or feeling on guard or watchful. And the symptoms need to last greater than 1 month again and cause this significant distress or impairment in functioning. And a lot of individual variability in how much these symptoms will impact someone's functioning. Just because someone has symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder doesn't mean that their functioning is necessarily going to be very impaired. PTSD, again, you might see grief if there were losses, and you may also see alcohol use, which is often comorbid with PTSD. Next slide, please. Common PTSD, again, it's in a minority of individuals, so that's why I also have disorder of recovery, because some people will think of this as, that PTSD is something that really is a failure of a recovery process. Most people after a traumatic event will experience these symptoms, but it's really a matter of how long that lasts and how severe an impact that has on your life. In the general population, in the civilian population, around 8% of individuals will develop PTSD, according to a national study of the morbidity study, which was done on a national representative sample. Women were twice as likely to develop PTSD as men, seem to be at higher risk, and the rates of PTSD vary depending on trauma type and severity. So it's different for rape versus natural disaster, so the likelihood that someone will go on to develop PTSD. Slide, please. In war settings, there's also been studies done with different eras of veterans. With Vietnam veterans, the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study looked at this era, and over lifetime prevalence, that is, over the lifetime of individuals who had served in Vietnam, about 31% of men and 26% of women developed PTSD. But at the time of the assessment, that prevalence was 15% for men and 8% of women. In Gulf veterans, the prevalence was found to be 10%, and for the current conflicts, the percentage that's been found for PTSD has really varied from 6% all the way up to 25%. OIF, again, for those who may not be familiar, is Operation Iraqi Freedom, and OEF, Operation Enduring Freedom. And these percentages will vary based on which population is used. So, for example, some of the higher percentages have been found in treatment-seeking populations, for example, those who have gone to the VA, versus if you look at some lower percentages that have looked at individuals who are serving in active duty and that kind of thing. There's reasons why those percentages vary across populations, but just to be aware that that this does vary. Next, please. But generally, for the returning veterans, the number of 15% has been quoted. And just to point out that PTSD is one consequence of being under highly stressful situations. Depression and anxiety are also, prevalent, and often these things go hand in hand. So it's not unusual if you have PTSD to also have some symptoms of depression. Next slide, please. Best practices for treatment. There are a number of evidence-based treatments for PTSD, and handout that you should have all received. If you go under the VA website, so the National Center for PTSD, their website, or afterdeployment.org, it can give you more information about best practices for treating PTSD, as well as the evidence-based treatments that are out there. One key element that I'd like to just make reference to is that family and social support is also a major recovery resource. And as Tim, I think we'll talk about later, peers are also a major resource. And being able to engage in activities that involve social support, family, peers, can be very important in recovery. Slide, please. I mentioned before, having post-traumatic stress symptoms does not necessarily lead to impairment in functioning. That varies per individual. There's people who can have severe PTSD symptoms and you never notice that. You will not necessarily see that in the work they're doing in their everyday life. There's others who, with a lower level of symptoms, experience greater impairment, and that can have to do with other factors outside of post-traumatic stress symptoms as well. I think this, aging veterans in service is just a really wonderful thing for both the organizations and the veterans. Veterans do bring so many strengths and abilities to to this kind of role. Just as an aside, in my clinical work, I work on a college campus, and I can't even tell you how many times I've had veterans come late for appointments simply because they were providing service to somebody in some way, whether it's helping somebody who had broken down on the side of the road or doing, but reaching out. And I feel like, service being such a core value of the military, it's just really wonderful to be able to use their abilities and skills in this way. And also, in a reciprocal way, being engaged in this kind of activity can actually benefit the veteran as well. Slide, please. And so there's many, many resources that are out there to learn more about post-traumatic stress, to learn more about the treatments for post-traumatic stress, as well as conditions that kind of go hand in hand with the symptoms. And so there will be another webinar where I'll be talking more about those things, and you're welcome. I would love it if you join for that. But thank you much for listening, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, or actually it's afternoon now. Can't really call it morning anymore. So my name is Tim Lovett, and I'm the Traumatic Brain Injury Project Coordinator to the State Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm here this morning with you to speak about this increasingly present injury. Help us help you understand and basic understanding about traumatic brain injury, and to do several useful resources. I realize there is a lot of ground to cover and not a lot of time to do it in, but know that if I'm unable to answer your questions during this presentation, I'm happy to connect with you afterwards, or even later on down the road should more questions arise. Contact information is right there on the screen, and that's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. Before I dive into the details about traumatic brain injury, I thought it might be useful to understand a little background about our project first. So next, please. So our TBI project was started a little over 3 years ago. It was by the Washington State Traumatic Brain Injury Commission because there are several needs within the veteran community that weren't being addressed. Among these were basic awareness about the injury and increased connection to services. For whatever reason, veterans didn't know about traumatic brain injury and reaching out for help. We basically partnered our State Department of Veteran Affairs and our State Department of Social and Health Services to help fix this. The VA contracted me to lead this effort in 2009. In a nutshell, I travel across the state, train veterans, family members, and service providers about TBI and help connect those who need help to the services that are available. Since the project started, we have been able to train over 3,000 people. We've reached over 6,000 community members and have connected over 250 veterans and family members to services. A very successful public and private partnership between state agencies contracting together. So I was chosen for this project basically because of my past experience with the two main subjects, veterans and traumatic brain injury. In 2008, I served as a part of the nation's first ever Vet Corps program here in Washington State. I was assigned to help veterans navigate the college system and encourage them to volunteer within their community, as well as them to services through our state and county and nonprofits as well. By having vets help other veterans in college, we could keep enrolled in classes and then eventually help them graduate, as well as leveraging their leadership, their talents, their skills within our communities as they are valued assets for our communities. And then we will be able to help offer them a way of continuing their service after the military. For a lot of veterans, I'm sure you've encountered in your interactions that continuing service is very important for a lot of veterans. I've actually served in the United States Army from 2001 to 2006, and to both Afghanistan and Iraq. During Iraq, I was blown up by a suicide car bomb. After that, I never realized that I had survived the TBI, and it wasn't until I came back home and enrolled in college when I realized that something was different about me. Very difficult, and my family life was kind of affected by it because of it. After doing some research on my own, I began to learn that I was, in fact, invisibly wounded with TBI, because I believe that my story is really not unique at all. A lot of individuals have gone through experiences, do know that they are injured, and that by learning about a little bit about this injury, you can help them understand about and help change for them. I've been with hundreds of veterans across the U.S., and many of them kind of share the same thing. They were military, something in their service. They had to get up and drive on because that's military culture. And now that they feel like they're not the same person as they were before. You probably heard stories like this before. If you have, you will, especially serving or engaging veterans in volunteering community service. Because like I said before, veterans do want to serve in their country, even after the military time is ended. However, the point I want to drive home is that you shouldn't be intimidated by this. These men have valuable skills you can utilize in your programs, and you can help them overcome whatever injuries they might have, especially if it is a TBI. You just know a little bit about the injury so that you can be prepared. So let's to defining traumatic brain injury. Before I explain this, I really try to do it with two definitions. The definition is kind of the more traditional one. It's an injury to the head in which some of the pre-existing functions and operations of the brain are disrupted. If you think of a computer has a whole bunch of different processes. It would like something going in there and messing one of those systems, and now your computer doesn't function how it used to, and whatnot. Or the more modern definition that I try to use is really that TBI, traumatic brain injury, is a term that is used to describe a wide range of head injuries, ranging from mild, moderate, and severe. So your mild TBI, or MTBI, that is essentially a concussion. People don't understand that concussions are actually a TBI, and they just don't see how it correlates. That's kind of a new modern definition comes into play. Next slide, please. So the question is, if it's got these three categories, how are categories essentially rated? And it's done to three kind of criteria. Or the second column that you see there, it's C, that's launch. So it's termed a mild brain injury if loss of consciousness is less than 30 minutes. It is termed moderate if that loss of consciousness is more than 30 minutes, but less than a day or 20%. And it's termed severe if it's greater than 24 hours. The images that you see next to mild, moderate, and severe eventually are the first total diagnosed and documented TBIs since the global war on terror began. So you see that about 60 to 85% of the TBIs that have been diagnosed since 2001 and such. The PTA column is post-traumatic event amnesia. Basically, how much they can remember about either the event or the events following a traumatic experience. And for that criteria needs to be less than 24 hours. For me, more than a day, but less than a week, and for more than a week. and you see those kind of lengths and times usually with like penetrating head wounds, more of the severe injuries. And then the last one, which is not performed all the time, just due to the kind of the rigors of the battlefield, is a Glasgow coma scale, and it's a wide range of physical and kind of cognitive tests that you could perform in the field, and based on those tests, you're assigned a rating. Once you get ratings for certain tasks, you add that up. That's your CS, and then that determines whether your injury is classified as a mild, moderate, or severe. Golf, you score, the worse your injury is. You score usually rock. You should be. So the symptoms. There are symptoms that we don't understand, and there's so many symptoms that we do understand, that it makes this injury really overwhelming for a lot of individuals. The thing to understand is really there's three categories that TBI survivors are affected: physical, cognitive, and emotional. I'll kind of break down the most common ones in the following slide. Next slide, please. Cognitive symptoms. Essentially, this is the thought processes and the rationale and logic that people maintain. The common ones are slow thinking, poor functional skills, lack of poor concentration, forgetfulness, or also memory problems, change in speech patterns, which could be a rapid acceleration in speech, slow and incoherent speech, or even slurred speech patterns, and processing information. Any of the things that are out of the ordinary or not individual used to operate could be cognitive symptoms. But the common ones, could you go back, please? The ones that I see with the majority of individuals that I work with are problems with the concentration and the memory one. Those are the two symptoms that really stand out the most, because usually they're the most frustrating for individuals trying to interact with their days. Next slide. Second category is physical symptoms. These include headaches, this sensitive light or noise, which is also known as ringing in the ears, changing, and this. The most common ones under this category that are about are headaches and tinnitus, and also trouble sleeping. If you know a little bit about post-traumatic stress and a little about traumatic brain injury, if you look at physical symptoms and even cognitive symptoms, overlap. It's really hard to tell these. So the important part is when you're communicating with veterans, if they're experiencing these, it doesn't matter. You're not going to diagnose them. It doesn't matter whether it's TBI or post-traumatic stress. The important part is to point out these are symptoms of these injuries, and that it may be a wise move for them to go ahead and access system that they prefer to get diagnosed and evaluation. Buster, the emotional symptoms is aggression, impulsivity, changes, mood swings, or also known as lability, ability of being emotionally withdrawn, or having a lot of anxiety and depression. And it gets really correlate very similarly to post-traumatic stress. The idea being that it's not for us as people interacting with veterans, we don't diagnose them. That's not our job. It's just to point out that these symptoms also happen to be symptoms of both of these injuries. So it's smart to get checked out. Now, this subcategory can either be a direct result of the injury, or it could be secondary side effects. Right. So when I came back out of the Army and I was going to college, the whole point of college is essentially to read a book, to get knowledge just long enough to pass your test, and then basically dump the memory once you aced it, or once you got the mark. Well, when I came back, my injury had affected my visual retention. So I would read a page, or whenever I would get to the bottom of the page, I would forget essentially what I had just been reading. And so retaining that information. Well, the side effect of that is that it would basically piss me off. I became angry because I had undergone this invisible change, and now all of a sudden I have to live up to the standards that I had for myself. So those changes or those symptoms were not a direct result of injury, but a secondary kind of side effect of it. I wanted to break down some numbers for you so you can get a kind of a better grasp on this injury known as the signature wound of Afghanistan and Iraq. So 2.4 million men and women have deployed to the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Since the Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center, you'll also call it, here it's called DIVBIC, they have recorded 244,000 traumatic brain injuries. These that they know about. These individuals have been diagnosed and have been provided accommodations within their military service, or have since transitioned out. How many they know? Several studies by the RAND Corporation, and RAND Corporation estimates that as many as 20% of those deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan has had some type of TBI. Okay, so if we look at those two numbers, 244,000 and 2.4, that's really only 10% of those who have gone to the current conflict. Estimate that number is twice as high. So it's very important for us to know this injury, because lots of individuals walking around that have no idea that they have this injury, not been diagnosed, have not been documented, and that significantly impact their life if they don't know that they have this injury. We also have to understand that every single service member that comes into the military is at risk for receiving some type of TBI during the service. Most branches, when you enter, you go out of training, which include hand-to-hand combat, fuel sticks. The impact of those can easily create concussion for the individual in that circumstance. Understand these and how they apply to the people you're involved with. This is a significant injury. I think it is drastically being underreported. Having a little knowledge and a little bit of foresight in your interactions. And really, a TBI does not impact a person's needs to be able to volunteer. It's just a little bit of obstacles for them that they're going to have to overcome. Just that I think are very valuable. The first email address. Please feel free to email questions, thoughts, comments. I'm more than willing to listen to those and send some feedback. The next one is DIVBIC, the Defense Veterans Brain Injury Center. If you go on their website, they actually have free resources that you can request. Good federal resource. If you're looking for just material that maybe you could put out in your center or whatnot. The next website is the Brain Injury Commission for Washington State. They're doing pretty innovative things, and I thought to include that. Did more kind of cultural competence or kind of PTSD 101. Visit the Veterans Training and Support Center. And this one is Washington State Department of Veteran Affairs website. Yeah. With that.
Good. This is Kent Corso. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am also a veteran. I work for Give an Hour. We are a non-profit organization providing free mental health services to active duty veterans and their family members. Just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to speak about these important topics today. I also appreciate the chance to collaborate with all those on this call, those who organized and are hosting this webinar as well. So each time I have, I'd like to provide a brief picture of the services we provide, discuss some of the barriers that we've overcome as an organization that has looked to the community to back to our service members, discuss how some of the systems have changed along with us, discuss how our program works to reach the veterans in our community. Please. And this image depicts the wounds of war are not always easy to see. One of the reasons I appreciate this picture is because although it points out that there are invisible wounds to this war, it's also important that we consider balance or striking a balance. Although there are invisible wounds, many of our members are fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, employees. It goes without saying that there's a variability in how they function. I believe Bob mentioned this, Shan mentioned this, but just because someone has post-traumatic symptoms or depression or TBI or any of the associated symptoms we see in this doesn't they're not functioning or not functional. Next, please. That we have that we hear in service members, so I like to go over a few quick points that I think is just a helpful premise of that population. Not all veterans are injured or broken. They are leaders. They are motivated. They're to contribute and serve, as both Jan and Tim and Bob mentioned. They are very effective parents or spouses, employees, gifted with specialized training and skills that are transferable to the civilian world. In many cases, they just need some training to reorient them to the civilian workplace. Earlier about several different types of symptoms that result from serving wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And if we consider that these members are being asked to function at the absolute peak of their mental and physical performance, sometimes with minimal to no sleep, and they're expected to function in a very small margin of error. Consider that when they force themselves to do that for months on end, come to a job that's stateside or even leaving the military and going to the civilian world, it takes an adjustment to sort of shift gears and get back to a moderate pace that is accommodating for sleep and things like that. So just about Give an Hour's philosophy, if we can go back to the slide deck, please. It was in 2005 by Dr. Barbara Van Dalen, a Washington, D.C. psychologist, to meet the mental health needs of the troops and police, as Bob mentioned, many of which are currently being unmet due to the amount of service members in need and limited number of resources available. So our 4 key goals are to educate the public, to develop a volunteer network of mental health professionals, to enable widespread access to this volunteer network, and to diminish stigma. The next. giving has a powerful effect on those who give and those who receive, and that we provide an opportunity for people to give back. It will promote dignity and self-respect. Is affected by this war, even if they're not the spouse of the service member themselves, and they need help dealing with the after effects of this service. Next slide, please. So this slide displays the scope of who are in our organization and the types of services we offer. And what we've asked of our community providers is to commit 1 hour a week for a year. And so by asking people in our community to just commit 1 hour, we're really able to make an impact when it gives just a little bit back. Next slide, please. Designed to plug gaps and complement the other services in place. We're not intending to be any sort of a comparator to the services that are currently available to veterans or active duty or family members. I can't emphasize enough how important collaboration is in this space. It's only through collaboration that we're going to truly be able to bring these service members into the civilian community and help them save the way they did when they were on active duty. Next slide, please. Out of our website, there's an arrow pointing to 4 visitors, which is what we call potential clients. So the system we use is quite simple. It's a web interface that matches up those in need with the providers who are willing to give. Next slide, please. When we were to click on 4 visitors, they would come up with this screen, allows the visitor to do a search for a type of specific provider within their zip code or a certain proximity to their zip code. Next slide. The interface, which is fairly straightforward. One of the things we found critical is that privacy helps these service members and family members be comfortable seeking help. So we provide contact interface between the providers and prospective clients, so that not collecting personal information on our users. Of course, we have ways of collecting data to understand who's using our services, but privacy is optimized, and that's something that's important when service members integrate into the civilian world, because oftentimes when they're service, there are compromises to privacy because they have a chain of command that has a right to know where they are and when and what they're doing. Next slide, please. Of 6,700 providers across all 50 states, and that list of problems are just a few of the types of things our providers will treat. Next slide, please. Our providers have given over 74,000 hours of service. I think just in the last month we've gone from 6,500 to 6,700. And the average rate of $100 an hour, our providers have donated over $7.4 million worth of free counseling education. Our President, Dr. Van Dillen, and given our representatives routinely speak at national and regional events. We've participated in White House discussions, testimony before the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Next slide, please. I mentioned before the White House Joining Forces Initiative. We've had the fortunate opportunity to be involved in that with Dr. Biden. Just the list of awards and recognitions we had. Please. To spend about seconds on is the Community Blueprint Network. This is a method by which we can engage all of our partners in the community. Many of them nonprofit organizations, other organizations are for-profit, but they all may have something to offer the veteran community and the veterans who are reintegrating into the civilian world. I encourage you to take a look at this network. It is another one of the ways that Givenhour has been able to sort of wrap our arms around our returning service members and help them navigate through areas of life such as finances, legal concerns, education, employment, mental health. I believe that there is another webinar that is offered on this topic. Next slide, please. Partners, again, one of the things that has been able to us and the impact we've had, that we are very competitive and reaching out at the community level, the local level, and the national and regional levels that we're able to such support. Essentially, we've found the organizations that are in this space trying to do the same work, and we've just found a way to coordinate services, because oftentimes there are so many or resources available, but not necessarily coordinated. Next slide. Next slide. Are there any questions or anything further I can provide? My information is there. Thank you much.
Thank you, everyone. This is Nikki Martin at Education Northwest. Debbie just posted a call for questions on the chat, and we'll give people a few minutes to type in any questions if they have them. In the meantime, I'll ask Debbie to go ahead and advance the slide, please. I want to make sure that you are aware of the Veterans and Military Families Knowledge Network. This is a good resource to continue this discussion and also pursue other topics of interest related to engaging and serving veterans and military families. We'll have the recording of this webinar, a captioned version, as well as chat transcripts. Folks have been sharing some really good resources in the chat, and we'll capture those. They will be, excuse me, at work in a few days. And in addition, you can find information there about recordings of previous webinars and also information about upcoming webinars. Our next month webinar will be February 27th, so stay tuned for more information about that. And also, we encourage you to attend the February 7th the February 7th webinar that Shannon mentioned and that you received an email about before the session. So let's go there and see if we have any
one question.
questions.
Do you have a mental health professional?
One question that was directed to the host, and I think it's for Kent. The question, do you have to be a mental health professional to volunteer to help veterans through your organization? Kent?
The question, you do not. We have over 600 non-clinical volunteers, and then also have probably a few hundred volunteers who are not mental health professionals, but they are sort of other helping modalities, things like acupuncture, equine therapy, art therapy. There are definitely opportunities to give back if you're interested. Feel free to contact me at the email address listed if you'd like.
You can. A question about the recording. It will be emailed to participants, and you will also be able to find it on the Knowledge Network. Barring any other questions, and not seeing any, I just want to thank everyone again and remind you to please take a moment to fill out the post-webinar evaluation. You'll see a survey pop up from WebEx itself, and then immediately after you'll see a brief survey from us. Just takes a couple minutes. And most importantly, I want to thank all of our presenters as well as Kobe and Bob for all of the work that you do, and invite Kobe to share any final words.
So again, I want to thank everybody, particularly our presenter, taking the time today to go through this, very important topic. This is a difficult topic to talk about in the national service community for a number of different reasons, but it's one that we've been asked to talk about, and it's one that that we talk about and share as much information as we can with those individuals that are engaging more veterans and military families in service, and also engaging more as members themselves. I do want to end on what I consider a very positive note, which is the quote that I kind of started some of the discussions with, and this is something that General George Casey frequently talks about. He's a former Chief of Staff of the Army, and he doesn't like to use the word post-traumatic stress disorder. He likes to say that he's a post-traumatic growth veteran, and that the experiences that you go through can be very traumatic and can be very debilitating. In some instances, can lead to tragic consequences, personal and professional consequences. But for the vast majority of veterans who come back, their military service is a positive experience, and the lessons that they learn in combat environment actually makes them stronger individuals and makes them more resilient. And honestly, my personal opinion, makes them more compassionate, having seen some of the more devastating effects of what can have. And these are some of the positive effects that these traumatic events can have in the lives of returning veterans, military family members. And I would just hope that people on this call keep that in mind as they continue to work in this space. And also keep in mind of the plethora of resources that are available out there for program managers and for AmeriCorps members themselves, as well as for individuals who want to expand their work in supporting veterans and military families in the behavioral health space. There's plenty of work to be done, and I appreciate everybody taking the time today to continue that work.
And good day, everyone.